very much for inviting me to present in your very nice conference. I was very interested in the first two presentations. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about the composition of different pasture plants, but also sort of forages in general, and then a little bit about their digestion utilization. Some of what you will hear from me is a repeat of what you've heard before, but I hope that that's okay and that we all have the same basic theme. To begin with, when we're thinking about what factors could affect the nutrients that are actually found in forages, we could consider several different areas. One of those areas would be the growing conditions, how the forage is actually grown and where it's grown, harvesting, storage conditions, stage of maturity, and plant type. So I will be addressing each one of those, but mostly focusing on stage of maturity and plant type. We think first about growing conditions. Some examples of that would be the composition of the soil that the forage is grown on. We know that as we move around the world, that soils have different levels of different minerals. And so there can be big differences between a forage grown in one place, even though it's the same type, and a forage grown in another. And that's true for minerals such as calcium and phosphorus, and trace minerals such as selenium and zinc. Fertilization practices also affect our growing conditions. And so things like what the forage producer will do in regard to applying nitrogen on the soil, or perhaps lime to change the pH, those sorts of things can also alter the nutrient composition of the forage. The next component would be the harvesting conditions. And so when the horse is grazing, they're doing all the work of harvesting. So here I'm going to mostly talk about harvesting conditions as they affect plants that are harvested for hay. So one of the components that can affect the composition of hay would be after the plant is cut. If it gets rained on, that rain can actually wash the nutrients from those plants. And so it can actually lower the nutrient composition for some types of nutrients. Likewise, management during the harvesting process can be important. So if the hay producer lets the plants dry too much and they become too dry and too brittle, then when the hay is actually baled, there can be a lot of shatter or crumbling of the different parts of the plant, and that can lead to nutrient loss too, because the leaves and the more tender parts that are more likely to shatter often are lost during the baling process and just end up back on the ground. And then the third of these would be the hay storage conditions. We know that when we harvest fresh grass, it is high in, for instance, many important vitamins. But once we harvest that material and place it in a bale and then put it into storage of some sort, many of the vitamins that were present originally can actually decrease during storage. So examples of that would be things like vitamin E would decrease during storage time as the hay is stored. Likewise, if the hay is stored in some place where there's exposure to rain or snow or even intense sunlight, that could also create some nutrient loss. So those are just some things that from a practical standpoint in managing horses or in obtaining our forages that we should think about. The two main characteristics that can affect nutrient composition, which was already discussed quite a bit before, would be the characteristics that are associated with what I am going to call stage of maturity. And by here, I'm talking about the maturity of the plant, not the animals that we're feeding it to, and then plant type. And the last speaker had a nice graph that I'm going to show probably a pretty similar picture of that discusses some things related to plant maturity. Your terms are a little bit different than our terms, but I think they represent the same concept pretty well. So I've broken this down into 4 stages of maturity. This would essentially be the growth stages of the plant. So the first one would be a vegetative plant. So this is when the plant is young, it's very leafy, it's in a rapid growth phase. And then as those plants become slightly more mature, what I call the pre-bud or pre-bloom or pre-flowering phase, they're getting ready to make reproductive organs, buds and flowers, but they're not there yet. Okay, so that would be the next phase, early maturity, which I'll just sort of use early maturity later, or pre-bud. Then those plants can actually go into a later maturity phase where they're actually starting to bloom. So now they're actually producing flowers. And then eventually those flowers will mature and those flowers then produce seed. And so that becomes the latest maturity phase. So these are the words that are used vary depending upon the type of plant to some extent, but essentially the pattern is the same. It's important to realize that if you cut the plant off when it's vegetative, right, it's going to grow back and be vegetative for a longer period of time. So when people talk about mowing a pasture or keeping it in a vegetative state, what they're trying to do is to prevent the plant from reaching later maturity. Okay? And that's because these different stages have different nutrient compositions. This is similar to the graph that Dr. Elias just showed us. We've got the different stages of the plant down here going from where it is just very early in the vegetative stage up to where it is actually now producing seeds. From the hay producer's standpoint, the hay producer often likes for the plant to get relatively mature because the plant is getting larger. And that means from the hay producer's standpoint, when they cut that field and make hay from it, a hectare will produce more kilograms if the plant is mature than it will if the plant is immature. On the other hand, when we think about quality, so this would have to do with nutritional quality or nutritional value, the plants are at their highest nutritional value when they are in their vegetative stage. And then as they start to move towards maturity, then their quality or nutritional value starts to go down. Okay, so these two sort of cross over in the middle. And from the horse owner standpoint, or people who are making recommendations, working with your forage producer to talk to them a little about what is the preferred maturity for your type of horses would probably be a useful thing. So this is one of the things that can affect the nutrient composition of forages. And here I have made a very simple table to discuss how stage of maturity affects alfalfa hay quality. And I've simply used 3 general terms. So early maturity, before the material is reaching or producing many buds, then mid-maturity where there are buds and maybe a few blooms, and then late maturity where it's in full bloom or perhaps in making even seed heads. And if we look at the percent of crude protein from these 3 different maturities, we can see that as the plant matures, crude protein concentration goes from 22 down to 15%. So a very large decrease associated with maturity. On the other hand, neutral detergent fiber, which is what the last speaker referred to as FND. So in America, we refer to it as NDF, neutral detergent fiber, but you guys call it FND. So just to make that difference, as the plant matures, the amount of neutral detergent fiber goes from around 38, it could be 34, whatever, could be 32, and then to around 44, and then at very late maturity, it would probably be around 50. So at this point, the plant has seed heads and is in full bloom. The acid detergent type fiber goes from 32 up to about 42. So protein is going down, but the fiber content is going up as the plant matures. So as we think about, let me make sure I did that right. Yep. So as we think about these changes in the growth stage of the plant, as the plant is getting taller, it needs to become more rigid so that it can actually stand up taller, right? And that occurs due to increased content of cellulose and lignin within the plant. The other thing that happens is that we see that there's a lot more stem material, right? And proportionally, there will be less leaf material. And that's important because the stems are lower in nutritional value compared to the leaves. So when we feed hay to horses, if we throw the hay into a feeder and all the leaves fall on the ground and the horse is not able to eat them, they're not going to get the most nutritious part of the hay. Okay? So as the plants mature, they become more rigid, and that's due to their increased cellulose and lignin content. So part of the structural carbohydrates in the forage. The neutral detergent fiber component, as we heard in the last lecture, includes hemicellulose and cellulose and lignin, whereas the acid detergent fiber contains the cellulose and the lignin. And if lignin is increasing and if cellulose is increasing, these are two of the least digestible components in the plant. So that means that as these compounds go up with advancing stage of maturity, the digestibility of the forage is going to go down. And that just reinforces what you heard in the last presentation. And you can see that here. So as we are going up in maturity, we can see that neutral detergent fiber is increasing. And so here we're going to have more cellulose and lignin, and these plants are going to be less digestible. That means fewer nutrients will be available to the horses. So with maturity, this is an example of a mature grass plant where you can see that there are large seed heads. The plant is quite tall. It's got a lot of stem. And so this plant, when you harvest it, even when you cut it down here, it's going to be more stemmy. It's going to be higher in acid detergent fiber, and it's going to be less digestible and provide fewer nutrients to the horse. The last indicator is going to be plant type. And I have divided my plant types basically into 3 large groups. And within each group, there are going to be some differences among the different plants, but I wanted to group them to give sort of an overall concept. So those group plants or plant groups are going to include legumes, cool season grasses, so grasses that typically enjoy climates like where I live, warm season grasses, which do well in the southern United States and perhaps in many places in South America, and then tropical grasses, which we don't really have in the United States to speak of, and I don't have a lot of experience with those, so I'm not going to address those to any extent. Saw some beautiful pictures of alfalfa that was being fed to horses in the last presentation. And this would be an example of some alfalfa where you can see a lot of leaves. And again, the nutrients are going to be in the leaves. You can see that the stems are very fine. This would be considered early maturity alfalfa and very high quality because the leaves are intact. So we know alfalfa and it's Medicago sativa. Another legume that is often fed to horses would be a type of clover. Particularly in pastures in the United States, we will have what is called white clover, and then sometimes raising for hay, we will use red clover. But generally speaking, the clovers are much less common for hay usage than alfalfa would be. And then 2 other legumes that can be used, which are not common in my part of the United States, but can be used, are lesbadisa and bird's foot trefoil. So just so you know that they all go into the same bucket along with alfalfa. But alfalfa is known as the queen of the forage crops, and that would be what most of the hay, most of the legume hay that's produced for horses would be alfalfa in the United States and probably worldwide. So some of the characteristics of legume hays would be that they are high in protein, so usually somewhere between 15 to 22%, depending upon stage of maturity. They are high in calcium, usually 1 to 2% calcium, and they tend to be moderate in fiber. And my numbers may vary a little bit from the ones that we saw in the last presentation, but typically at least the types of alfalfas that we would see that are being fed to horses would have a neutral detergent fiber concentration of approximately 35 to 45%. Acid detergent fiber would be lower than that, with the lower values for neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber being in the early maturity plants, and relatively high in calories, so somewhere between 1.9 to 2.4 megacalories of digestible energy per kilogram. So pretty high, can be quite high in terms of supplying calories. The cool season grasses that are often fed to horses include timothy, orchard grass, which was in my previous picture, brome grass, which is more common in the northern United States, ryegrass, which is common in pastures, could be perennial ryegrass or annual ryegrass, and then reed canary grass, which would be common in some areas. And one of the things that we would see is that certain plants are well adapted to certain types of soils and certain climates. So the type that is most common in one part of the world maybe not well adapted in another part, and a different grass would be used. Comparatively, if we think about their nutrient components, they tend to be low to moderate in protein, so usually somewhere between 7 to 13%. That will vary a little bit with the amount of nitrogen fertilization that they have, and it will also vary greatly with stage of maturity. So lower protein in the more mature grass hays. Compared to the legumes, they tend to be much lower in calcium, somewhere between 0.2 to 0.5, and often they will reflect the amount of calcium that is present in the soil that they're grown upon. They tend to be moderate to high in fiber, so neutral detergent fiber between 55 and 65%, acid detergent fiber between 40 and 45. And they are low to moderate in calories. So very mature grass hays can be as low as 1.5 megacalories of DE per kilogram, which would be considerably lower than what we would see for the comparable alfalfa at a comparable stage of maturity. The last category would be the warm season grasses. The two most common warm season grasses that are used here in the United States would be what we call Bermuda grass, and then the other would be what we call Bahia grass. And Bermuda grass is commonly raised for both pasture and hay, whereas Bahia grass is typically only used for pasture because it has a very low growth habit, so it doesn't grow tall enough to make really good hay. These, again, are grasses that are well adapted to warmer climates. There are some Bermuda grass varieties that can winter or survive winter in my part of the world, which is central Kentucky. But if you go more northerly in the United States or in a colder climate, they won't return every year. Some of their nutritional characteristics would be that, again, here I just said that they were variable in protein, and even more so than the grasses would be. And they are quite sensitive to nitrogen fertilization. So if you grow a warm season grass and provide a lot of nitrogen, you can actually get a fairly high level of crude protein. It's important to know that some of the warm season grass hays can actually accumulate nitrates And those nitrates can be problematic, particularly for ruminant animals. So depending upon fertilization, if you were to see a very high crude protein concentration, it might be prudent to have that warm season grass tested to make sure that the nitrates aren't particularly high. On the other hand, if they are not fertilized with nitrogen and they are quite mature, their protein level can be quite low. So the variation can go from somewhere between 6 and 7% up to over 20%. They are also low to moderate in calcium, and they are moderate to very high in fiber. So in terms of the warm season grasses, when they start to reach more advanced stages of maturity, the neutral detergent fiber concentration can actually go above 65%, maybe as high as 70 or 72%. So they can be quite high in neutral detergent fiber. However, the acid detergent fiber content is a little less variable, and that is because the difference between the neutral detergent fiber and the acid detergent fiber is actually hemicellulose. And so they tend to have a little more hemicellulose than perhaps some of the cool season grasses might have. And hemicellulose is a little bit more digestible than cellulose, so it actually sort of evens out the effect of increased NDF on the digestibility. And their calorie values are very similar to what we would see in cool season grass hays as well. Again, variation due to maturity. If the warm season grasses are very low in protein and they're very high in fiber, then you might see lower calorie values for these particular plants. So having said all that, I think the take-home message here would be that not all hays are the same, that depending upon how the hay is harvested, stored, where it's grown, and then its stage of maturity and its type, it can be highly variable in terms of nutrient composition. So that's the first take-home message. There can be a lot of variation, and you need to understand if you're providing or recommending hays for horses, you want to understand what those compositional differences may be. So if I were to line them up then to think about nutritional value of these common forages, the highest nutritional value is going to be with early maturity alfalfa, then mid-maturity alfalfa, then early maturity grass, then late maturity alfalfa, then mid-maturity grass, and then the lowest is going to be late maturity grass. So if you think about them in that context, now you can sort of rank the particular forage in terms of its nutrient value, and that can then help guide you on what its best purpose is going to be, which we'll talk about in a minute. From a quality standpoint, early maturity alfalfa is by far the most nutritious forage that we can typically feed to horses. And sometimes most nutritious is interpreted as the best. I probably have a little bit of a different point of view than some other folks, but I want you to consider that while it may be the most nutritious, it may or may not be the best. I'll go through some examples or some case studies where you can sort of think about that concept. So when someone asks me about the best hay or what hay I would recommend that they should purchase for their horse, the first thing that I'm going to tell them is that regardless of all of those plant type and stage of maturity considerations, the first component is that the hay should be clean. And last presenter talked about that. So that means it needs to be free from mold, free from dust, free from toxins, and free from plants that can injure the horses. This is some hay that has some mold in it, and that can irritate the horse's respiratory tract. This is a bale that was opened, and there was actually barbed wire inside. So if you were feeding that and you didn't identify that that was in there, the horses could get tangled in it. And over here we have a plant that we call a thistle, and this thing has big thorns on it that could injure the horse's mouth. So if something like this is baled up in the hay, the horses may be able to pick around it, or they may consume it, and then that can damage their mouth. So the most important thing before anything else is that the hay should be clean. And so it should be free from all of these other components. And then the second thing, which is always what I ask horse owners or people that ask me about feeding hay to horses, is it depends upon what kind of horse you have, okay, and what kind of horse you're feeding. So the hay that you select needs to be appropriate for the needs of the horse that you're feeding. Okay. So that's a very important concept. And not, I guess I would say, and not all horse owners always understand what the nutrient needs of their particular horse might be. So there's an educational opportunity there. Here are some different types of horses that can have fairly variable needs. I'm going to start here. This is a mare that is in early gestation, and her nutrient needs are actually quite low. So she's in early stage pregnancy. She's barely above what we would consider maintenance. And so her nutrient needs are low. Likewise, this is a breeding stallion who is in this picture. It was not during the breeding season. He probably has relatively low nutrient needs as well. If we move up the scale, we can think about horses that are used for recreational riding or light to moderate exercise. And their requirements are higher than maintenance, but they're not really high. And surveys suggest that horse owners who are recreational riders, so they ride a couple times a week or even several times a week and maybe do some horse showing, they almost always overestimate how much work their horse is getting. Then we have a 3-day eventing horse at a very high level. We have a weanling who has high requirements for both calories and protein and minerals. We have a lactating mare, and we have a racehorse. Okay, so we're starting at the lowest, and then we're thinking about sort of moving up that scheme. This is a slide that I showed to my students in class to help them understand the hierarchy of which horses have the most intense nutrient needs and which ones have the least intense nutrient needs. So very heavy work would be racehorses. Lactating mares are right below them and very close. They actually have higher needs for some things. Then we have heavy work. So this would be sort of elite 3-day eventing horses, polo ponies that compete a lot, horses in those categories, or perhaps race horses in training, but maybe not actively racing yet. Then we have weanlings. Then we have horses in moderate work. Then we have yearlings. Then we have a mare that's in late gestation, so 10 or 11 months of pregnancy. An active breeding stallion who is essentially pretty much just like light work. Then we've got mid-gestation, so mid-pregnancy, an inactive breeding stallion, early gestation, and idle. Okay, so over here we have horses that have elevated nutrient requirements. Over here we have ones that have pretty low. So important take home. The best forage for a lactating mare may not be the best forage for a gelding that's in light work. Okay. We want to match the composition of the forage to the requirements of the horse. Here are the nutrient needs of those different types of horses. So these values are from the National Research Council publication, The Nutrient Requirements of Horses from 2007. And I've only pulled out digestible energy, grams of crude protein, grams of calcium, and grams of phosphorus. And I have aligned the horses essentially in highest calorie need to lowest calorie need. So I'll start with the racehorse. So the racehorse requires somewhere in the vicinity of 35 megacalories of digestible energy per day, around 1,000 grams of crude protein, around 40 grams of calcium, around 29 grams of phosphorus. The lactating mare is right below the racehorse in terms of energy because she's putting a lot of energy into the milk, and it takes a lot of milk, a lot of energy to actually make milk. Look at her protein requirement compared to the racehorse, because she's going to put a lot of protein that her baby needs, her foal needs, into the milk. Look at the calcium. It's also very high because she's putting a lot of calcium into the milk. Likewise, phosphorus. So when you look at this, you can start to see that, well, there are some pretty different requirements based just on these two horses. The late gestation mare, quite a bit lower. Pregnancy is a large nutritional commitment, but it is spread over a very long period of time. So they're pregnant for 11 months. And so gestation is a long period of time. And so while at the end, they're producing a large foal, right? It's a more gradual impact in terms of their nutrient requirements. And then we have light work, so that recreational riding horse. And we can see here that it's way lower than what we would see for a racehorse. And then the last one is an idle horse that has very low requirements relative to the other types of horses. So putting that in the context then of, okay, which forage are we going to pick for which type of horse? So the question becomes, what's the best hay for horses? This graph that I have created has 3 different types of forages. We have late maturity grass. So this would be something like a late maturity orchard grass or a late maturity Bermuda grass, something of that nature. Then we have some mid-maturity alfalfa, so probably mid-bloom, somewhere in there, and then an early maturity alfalfa. And I have then calculated, based on consuming 10 kilograms of hay, so that would be about 2% of body weight for a 500 kilogram horse, the grams of crude protein that would be provided by this 10 kilograms of hay. So I hope that's clear. So as we look across for these 3 different forages, we can see that the late maturity grass hay provides 600 or so, 700 or so grams per day. The mid-maturity alfalfa is basically twice that or more. And the early maturity alfalfa is even more than that. So giant differences in what the nutrients that are provided by these 3 different forages. I did the same thing for calcium. So here we have 50 grams of calcium in 10 kilograms of hay would be this white line here. We can see that the late maturity grass is much lower than that. We can see that the mid-maturity alfalfa is around 100 grams in these 10 kilos, and that the early maturity would be even higher than that. Okay, so that's the calcium component. And then the last one that I did, pick up the pace, the last one that I did was the digestible energy. They're a little bit closer together than the other 2 nutrient components, but even so, you can see that there are differences in the total calories, the digestible energy, that's going to be provided by these 10 kilos of hay. Okay. So keep that idea in your mind, because now we're going to do a couple of little comparisons. So here's my first question. What would be the best hay for lactating mares? So mares have high crude protein requirements. This yellow line represents the amount of crude protein that this mare needs in her first month of lactation on a daily basis. The only one of these forages that would meet her protein requirement is going to be the early maturity alfalfa. Doesn't mean you can't add extra protein with a concentrate, but you won't have to add as much with the concentrate, right? So on the other hand, the late maturity grass hay, in order to provide enough crude protein for this mare, you would have to use a very high crude protein concentrate. Okay, so next take-home message, we should pick the forage that best adapts, and the forage is going to affect the composition of the concentrate that you would select to use for your horse. The second one is calcium. Again, this is the yellow line for the mare's requirement. Both the mid-maturity and the early maturity alfalfa will meet that requirement. The late maturity grass hay will not. And if she was only getting late maturity grass hay and she was only getting this amount of calcium, what this lactating mare would do would be to mobilize calcium from her skeleton to put it into the milk for the baby. And for mares that are in commercial breeding programs where they have multiple pregnancies, that would not be a desirable thing. So we want to meet her calcium need so that we can maintain her skeletal integrity. The last one would be looking at the calories. So again, here's the requirement for the mare up here. And we can see that the early maturity hay gets the closest. The mid-maturity alfalfa is next. And then the late maturity grass hay is the furthest away from meeting her requirements. So generally speaking, in order to meet this gap compared to this gap, you're going to have to feed a lot more concentrate, or it's going to have to be a much more energy dense concentrate. So if you can meet their energy needs more closely with the forage, it means that you can invest less in paying for the concentrate. And that may be, in many cases, economically desirable. So that's the lactating mare. That's one case study, one scenario. What about horses that are in light exercise? Well, here's the protein requirement for horses that are used. This is a horse that was being used as a hunter jumper equitation style horse. This is a Western pleasure horse. Here's their protein requirement. And you can see that although the late maturity grass doesn't quite get there, the other two greatly exceed that. If we look at their calcium requirement, we see the same basic effect, right? There's no benefit in terms of high crude protein or high calcium forages for horses that have these low calcium and low crude protein requirements. For calories, keep in mind that these horses have reasonably low calorie requirements or energy requirements, if you want to look at it that way. The grass hay actually gets reasonably close to that. So does the mid-maturity alfalfa. The early maturity alfalfa probably meets it or potentially will exceed it slightly. So in many cases, if we're feeding very high quality hay to horses that are recreational riding horses, right, the hay alone can be very close to meeting their requirements, and the amount of concentrate that could actually be needed might be very small. And what about the idle horse? Well, if we just looked at digestible energy, or an idle horse or a horse that's doing very little, we call them pasture ornaments. That 10 kilos of hay, when we think of this very high quality forage, it's going to exceed, if we feed them 10 kilograms, it's going to exceed their digestible energy requirement. Now, you can feed that very high quality alfalfa hay to a recreational or idle horse and meet their needs, but you're probably going to have to restrict the amount that you feed. Otherwise, they will get fat. Okay, so you may have to restrict the intake by quite a lot. And you can restrict intake, but as Elias just talked about, horses are going to chew on something, whether it's forage or whether it's the barn or the fence or their neighbor's tail. And so while you can feed less of the hay that has really high nutrient value and restrict their intake, it may not be the management practice that you want to use. So what would be better would be to select a forage that has lower nutrient content so you can feed more of it and provide adequate chewing time, eating time for those horses. So a few closing remarks, common questions about forages and horses. The best forage, in my opinion, depends upon the horse that's being fed. You should align the nutrient content of the hay with the needs of the horse, understanding that horses with high nutrient needs can utilize forages with higher nutrient contents, and that the nutrient content of the forage is going to affect the amount and the composition of the supplemental feeds that are needed. Okay, so we're trying to essentially balance or use complementary feeds that go together to meet the needs of the horse that we're feeding, and that we should always use clean forage. Oops, sorry. A few frequently asked questions. So these are things that people invariably will ask me at some point in time. Isn't alfalfa too rich for horses? And I would like to show you this comparison. So this is a picture of pasture in central Kentucky in late spring, in June. And if you were to sample this pasture and put the results on a dry matter basis, the spring pasture would have about 2.4 megacals of digestible energy per kilogram. It would be about 20% crude protein. It would be about 0.5% calcium and 0.4% phosphorus. If you were to compare that to early maturity alfalfa, it's very similar in terms of digestible energy. It's just a tiny bit lower in terms of crude protein. It is lower in calcium. It's probably a little bit lower in terms of phosphorus. Okay. But if we're thinking about richness in terms of energy or protein, vegetative, high quality pastures can be very, very high in nutrients. Okay. So if we're replacing, as this pasture goes into dormancy in the summer, and we're starting to replace it with some type of hay, we need to think about what was the composition of the pasture that the horses were consuming. The next question is, so you've talked about energy, protein, calcium, and phosphorus. Does that mean that we can feed just forage alone? And the answer to that is for a while, but probably not recommended. Because almost all forages are likely to be low in many trace minerals, things like zinc and copper, and they're typically low in sodium and chloride. So if nothing else, the horse needs some kind of a salt block. And keep in mind that stored forages like hay are also likely to be low in some vitamins, for instance, vitamin E and vitamin A. So hay alone might meet the energy and calcium and protein needs, but it's likely that there are some nutrient needs that will not be met. And those then need to be provided by supplemental feeds of some type. Another frequently asked question is whether or not I can feed hay cubes or hay pellets instead of long stem hay or pasture. So can you simply swap out your long stem hay and instead use hay cubes or hay pellets? From a nutritional standpoint, the hay cubes and the pellets are very similar, okay? But they're not similar in terms of their functional characteristics. So they don't provide the chewing activity or the chewing time, and therefore the salivation that was just talked about as long stem hay. Okay, and so that chewing activity is very important for protecting the gastric mucosa, right? So we know that that's important. And we know that chewing time from a behavioral standpoint, which was just talked about, is also important. So the long stem hay might be nutritionally the same as the cubes, but the cubes and especially pellets, which are much smaller, don't provide perhaps the same functional characteristics in the horse's digestive tract. To kind of sum that up, many horse owners and horse managers have different types of horses at their operation. So maybe they have some lactating mares. Maybe they have some mares that are in early gestation. Maybe they have some horses that are home and are on rest time. So they have basically maintenance. So when you have different types of horses, what do? Obviously, pasture is really desirable because the horses have access to the nutrients and they can socialize and they can move around, and generally the environment is good. So pasture is always a desirable choice. On the other hand, too much high quality pasture, which was just talked about, too many nutrients, especially too much rapidly fermentable or too many calories, can lead to weight gain or too rapid growth in our young horses. So here's a pasture that doesn't look even all that wonderful, and yet this mare is quite fat. And so high quality pastures, great for horses that have high nutrient needs. But if you're putting horses with low nutrient needs on those pastures, you need to be extremely cautious. So I have different types. What in the winter time or when pasture's not available, what kind of hay should I choose when pasture's not available? So first quality is it has to be clean, first characteristic, because you can fix the nutrients missing based on hay type and stage of maturity with extra concentrate or less concentrate, but you can't fix the contaminants that are in the hay that the horse might be eating. So you want it to be clean. If it was me and what I would do in my own world, I would select an early to mid maturity alfalfa or alfalfa grass mix because it's in the middle of the road. It's not going to greatly exceed the requirements for those horses with high requirements. And it's going to be close to meeting the requirements of the horses with, say that again. If I have something in the middle, it's close to meeting the needs of the horses that are lower, but I can use extra concentrate to meet the needs of the higher. So something in the middle and then supplement as needed based on the horse requirements. And I think that pretty much ends my talk. And I would like to thank you for inviting me again. I've been to Argentina and to Brazil, but never to Mexico. So maybe at some point in the future, I'll get to do that. Thank you.